Flames from Nowhere. Written by Petr Macek, music by Daniel Barták, read by Jamie Marshall. Of all the possible ways to take the life of one's fellow man, I consider fire to be the most repulsive. Any violent death is horrific and tragic. Indeed, the infamous Whitechapel murders will remain before my eyes until I draw my last breath. But as a physician, I know how slowly and painfully flames kill. Slashing, stabbing, and firearms, if handled properly, can kill instantaneously. But fire suggests that the arsonist enjoys watching his victims suffer, like a beast toying with its prey. In my opinion, no living being deserves to burn. Not even Sir Roger Singleton, to be sure. Had we not been nearly trampled by a speeding horse-drawn fire engine, equipped with hose and manual pump festooned with firemen in blue uniforms, while crossing the street near our lodgings, we might have noticed his name in the newspapers only on the following day, where his mysterious death would certainly have occupied considerable space, with headlines several inches tall. Instead, the naturally inquisitive Holmes set off immediately in the direction of the speeding fire engine, followed by a gaggle of children clamouring for a cool shower on a hot day. I, of course, went with him. The loud clanging of the bell, calling for help, brought together an excited crowd, which converged just a few corners down from a multi-story office building that housed a number of businesses, the largest being a certain shipping company. According to a prominent metal sign, partially obscured by a mature plane tree at the edge of the pavement, its offices occupied the third floor. To my surprise, however, the fire brigade had not yet begun untangling the hoses, and the fire hydrant was still intact when we arrived at the site a few minutes later. In spite of their previous haste, the firefighters were now sitting awkwardly on the fire engine's footboards, and it was clear from their spotless uniforms that they had not attempted yet to tame the flames. Their commander stumbled out of the open door of the house, removed his shiny helmet, and wiped his sweaty brow with his sleeve. He was pale and exchanged a frightened glance with the constable, who was fighting to hold back the sensation-seeking, shouting crowd of onlookers, which continued to swell. Holmes and I pushed forward. "I've never seen anything like it before," the fireman said, his voice constricted with terror. "I took but a little peep inside and dared not go any further." The constable nodded. "I'd rather stay down here and wait until the men from the commissioner's office arrive." My friend glanced back at me stealthily and raised his eyebrows. "Come along, Watson. I'm becoming rather curious," he beckoned, elbowing his way towards the officer. "What has happened here?" Holmes addressed him with natural authority. The man, like most police officers in London at the time, knew Holmes well and was aware of his contribution to the suppression of crime and maintenance of public welfare in general. Moreover, he was visibly relieved to see somebody with experience on the scene, so he addressed the detective as if he were his superior. "Good afternoon, Mr. Holmes," he saluted. "There was a call from the house a few minutes ago. There was a fire, so I summoned the fire brigade." "And why aren't they doing anything? Why don't they put it out?" I inquired. Because it was no ordinary fire," the policeman said haltingly, avoiding our gaze. "Could you please be more specific?" Holmes frowned. The poor fellow was rigid with fright. It wasn't a house fire or anything like that. He swallowed hollowly. I ran briskly up to the third floor, opened the door, and there was Sir Roger, burning up. I'm afraid he's beyond help. His words sent shivers up my spine. The detective, on the other hand, perceiving the possibility of an interesting case, was able to fully suppress any excess of sensibility. May we take a look upstairs? He inquired almost eagerly. The police officer pointed us to the story in question, insisting in a trembling voice that it was essential for him to remain below and maintain order on the street. We did not object, seeing his horror at the mere idea of returning to the scene. Holmes and I ascended to the shipping company offices alone. In the entrance hall, dominated by a majestic life-size portrait of the proprietor, we found the secretary slumped on the sofa for visitors. In a state of utter shock and incapable of speech for the moment, she stared at the open door of the owner's study with protruding eyes. A small man with gartered sleeves, who appeared himself to be in need of professional help, was attempting to comfort her, albeit without great success. The other employees, mostly made up of women, typists, sat nervously at their desk in their work cubicles. Intuitively, the detective strode to the door, but as he reached for the handle to open it, he hissed. "Be careful, Doctor, but it's still hot," he warned me, lest I too should burn myself, and he drew a silk handkerchief from his breast pocket, with which he opened the double doors. The secretary whimpered and buried her face in her colleague's waistcoat so as not to see anything more. Indeed, the horrific sight that presented itself was not for the faint of heart. Sir Roger, or what was left of him, was smouldering in the armchair beneath the window. There was the partially burned torso of a stocky male figure. The fire had consumed him sitting up, while the lower half of his body was surprisingly well preserved. His legs from the knees down were relatively undamaged, attired in the trousers of an expensive pinstriped suit, and beige spats over his shoes. Very little remained of the upper half of the body, on the other hand. The torso had burnt to a crisp, leaving several very ragged cracks. The skin had fused with the clothes, and there was no face left to speak of. It had melted as though it were made of wax, the bare skull exposed in several places. The charred arms hung limply alongside the body, barely remaining attached at the shoulders. Yet the palms and the manicured fingers with the massive rings were intact. The armchair, which barely held together, was also destroyed, as was the side table standing next to it, with a pair of charred and ruined spectacles. The floor in the immediate vicinity was cracked with heat. Greasy ashes flew about the air with a lingering odor of burnt flesh. The rest of the room was in remarkable order, and apart from the omnipresent soot, there was no sign of the tragedy that had taken place. "Do not touch any metal objects. They're only just cooling," Holmes warned me. I had seen many scorched scenes of fire and mutilated bodies, but never had I seen flames target a single object in this manner. It was as if they cared for nothing else and needed only to feed on their victim, or as if someone had set them deliberately. "Please open the window and air the place out," the detective requested, handing me his handkerchief to cover my mouth and nose. He did not need it. While he examined the dead man closely, I stepped over to the window, under which lay several fallen black cinders and scraps of paper, turned the handle and opened it wide to give fresh air to my lungs. "Remarkable," muttered Holmes, fascinated. "At first sight, it looks as though the fire ignited around the stomach and consumed the poor fellow at once." We looked around, but saw nothing that could have caused such a blaze. There was merely a discarded blanket lying on the floor near the door, which had been used to extinguish Sir Roger. On the desk were writing pad and utensils, a jar of emollient cream, a crystal decanter of brandy 2/3 empty, and 2 short-stemmed glasses, one of which was cracked. "He was having a drink with someone here, most likely the murderer," I said, pointing to the decanter. The detective examined it, then returned it to its place and knelt down gingerly beside the chair, where he blew away the ashes and studied the remains of the dead man's hands and feet closely. He did not put up any struggle at all. Had he twitched or attempted to run, he would have scraped the floor with the soles of his shoes, but he seems not to have even noticed what was happening. "He must have been unconscious," I reasoned. "Yes, that is certainly one possible deduction," Holmes smiled. "There are no charred remains of rope, so he was not physically restrained." "What a bizarre way to murder a person," I sighed. "We must first identify the origin or cause of the fire," Holmes said reluctantly. "Only then can we determine with certainty how Singleton died. However, I agree that it was not spontaneous combustion. He was alluding to the fanciful superstition so appealing to journalists that arose from time to time in the cases of unexplained fires. The idea that fire could originate in the human body without an apparent source of combustion was first put forward in the summer of 1746 by one Paul Raleigh, a Fellow of the Royal Society, in the journal Philosophical Transactions. His treatise dealt with the mysterious death of the Italian Countess Cornelia Zangheri Bandi, whose maid had found only a pile of soot and 3 fingers in her place in the bed. As in the case of the poor noblewoman, there was nothing here from which the fire could have originated. There's no hearth with burning embers or candles in the room, nor, judging by the absence of smoking paraphernalia, did Sir Roger indulge in the habit. And as the building was lit by electricity, no kerosene lamps were used. "Let us speak to the staff. We may be wiser then," he suggested, whereupon we returned to the lobby of the company's offices, where a sombre atmosphere prevailed. The diminutive accountant, who had been comforting the female clerks, moved to speak. "Miss Fitzpatrick knocked on Sir Roger's door at 3:00 to tell him that she was leaving for the post office, as she did every afternoon," the man said eagerly. "The position of his desk allowed him a fine view of the entire office." The young woman, still shaking from the shock of her experience, blinked and nodded. "Then I reached for the door handle, but it was all hot," she piped softly. "I pushed the door open and saw what was happening. Miss Fitzpatrick shouted, 'Fire!' and I threw a blanket over the gentleman to smother the flames. But it was no use," added the accountant. Holmes measured the accountant and the other ladies with a stern look. "Who visited Sir Roger during the morning?" "Nobody," the secretary shook her head. "His diary for today was blank. He wasn't supposed to have any appointments or meetings. He was locked in there by himself all day." I cannot speak for my friend, but I myself was puzzled. "What happened in that study is definitely not a suicide." Holmes pointed to the door. "You say no one else went in?" "I've been sitting outside his door since morning. Indeed, I haven't even taken luncheon," she confided, as if our doubts had infused energy into her veins. "But we are 8 of us here in this office. If you don't believe me, ask the others," she exclaimed defensively. "I can confirm that," the little man chimed in, standing up for the lady. "Even if Gladys had popped out, there were 7 other pairs of eyes on Sir Roger's door. No one was here." "I'm not suggesting that I don't believe you," the detective assured her. "I am merely ascertaining the facts." There is a decanter on the desk that is almost empty. He must have drunk it with someone, I remarked. Fitzpatrick blew her nose loudly. It was full only last night. I refilled it myself, she marvelled. The gentleman insisted on it, and it was the last thing I did every night. The detective continued to deliberate. Did either of you hear the sound of a scuffle from the study? Anything strange? Nothing at all. It was only now that Holmes showed any exasperation. It takes several hours to char a body in that manner. I find it difficult to believe you failed to notice a fire blazing in the adjacent room. The accountant let out an agonized groan. It is the height of summer, a hot day, indeed the hottest of the year, and it never occurred to anyone that the heat could be from anything else. He threw up his hands. Besides, the windows are open, there's plenty of bustle outside, the typists are always chattering inside and tapping away at the machines. We really heard nothing else. Nor did you smell anything burning, I said, frowning. My dear sir, we live in central London. We're accustomed to any variety of odours. I had to admit that his reasoning was quite sound. The detective's aggravation, which he tended to show when the solution to a mystery eluded him, abated, and he proceeded to speak to the accountant and the ladies more gently. He paced about the office, pausing at various points to look back at the door. He examined what could be seen from each position and under what conditions. He exchanged a few words with each of the distraught typists and asked them not to leave quite yet. Among other things, they all confirmed that their employer was not a smoker, and like us, none of them had the least idea what could have caused the fire. When was the last time you saw Sir Roger? Holmes asked when he returned after a moment to the central pair. It must have been around 8 o'clock, when he came into the office, said Miss Fitzpatrick. What kind of spirits was he in? Poor, admitted the secretary. But with all due respect, that was not out of the ordinary with him of late. He instructed us that he did not wish to be disturbed, and merely assigned us our tasks. Are you aware of any troubles, any motive, or how anyone could benefit from Sir Roger's death? I must know everything, even those details which you might find seemingly unimportant. The accountant loosened the collar of his shirt and shrugged. There are many such people, he sighed. As Gladys intimated, Mr. Singleton has recently been involved in a number of business disputes, some of which are certain to end up before the courts, and without wishing to be indiscreet, he had no reason to be happy at home. Despite the stoic expression Holmes had assumed, I noticed that the last statement piqued his interest. His son had decided to go to America and start a business there, refusing to take over the family enterprise, explained the accountant, who had sensed the same keenness. With this, however, the spark in Holmes's eyes faded away. So it was not in his interest to inherit the business now and attach himself to London, he reflected, scratching off the gentleman's son as a suspect in his mind. I assumed that we would now follow the trail of the aforementioned business disputes. It made sense to me. Singleton might have received his adversary in secret, shared a drink or two, but reached no agreement. On the contrary, the feud had escalated and this heinous murder had been committed. But how the perpetrator had come and gone unnoticed, by what means he had committed the attack, and how was it that no one had heard anything outside the study door, I was truly at a loss to understand. Yet I was certain that if anyone could solve the mystery, it would be Sherlock Holmes. He stood in the middle of the room, listening intently to the sounds within and without. He closed his eyes. From the street came the noise and chatter of curious onlookers. The investigators from the yard are still nowhere in sight, but a whole throng of reporters are here already, the detective observed, leaning against the sill and glancing briefly out of the window. He looked around for a moment, shading his eyes as he peered at something in the distance, perhaps on the roof of the building across the street. And then, as if struck by a sudden thought, he turned back into the room. "Watson, you opened the window when we entered Sir Roger's study, did you not?" "Yes, you asked me to do so yourself," I reminded him. "Had it been closed before?" he lashed out at the accountant. "No, it had been open," the man blinked. "I closed it, for I did not want prying eyes from the house opposite or from the rooftop looking in." Holmes clapped his hands. "Why did you not mention it before, man? It changes the situation entirely." He strode briskly into Singleton's study and headed straight for the window. "It should have occurred to me immediately," he exclaimed, pointing to the black-rimmed scraps of paper on the floor beneath the window next to the table with the spectacles. He picked them up, examined them, and replaced them carefully. The draft must have blown them about when Fitzpatrick opened the door. "Do you suppose someone threw something into the room?" I guessed at his line of reasoning. The detective opened the window wide. The branches of the plane tree spread out a few feet before him. "It is obvious," I answered myself. "Someone climbed up here and threw an incendiary device or explosive at Sir Roger." I rejoiced at having discovered the solution. Yet I received not praise, but a critical analysis of my speculations. "Then the murderer must have been a trained monkey or a rickety child," Holmes chided. "Observe the thickness of those branches. They could not possibly bear the weight of any man I know, and the thicker ones nearer the trunk grow at such an angle that you could not see through the window from them. The blast of an explosive would be heard both indoors and on the street. Besides, plenty of people would have seen such an attacker, for we are on a busy thoroughfare. And Sir Roger would have easily shaken off any other conventional, flammable material and fled from the window." There was a whole battery of arguments against my reasoning, and it fell to pieces. "Then who set Sir Roger on fire, and how?" I exclaimed. "Wait here, Watson. I am sure you will have your answer presently." He walked solemnly around the charred body of Sir Roger, past the accountant and the ladies waiting at the door, requested their patience and hurried away. A moment later, I saw him dash from the building, weave his way through the crowd to the trunk of the plane tree, and examine its surface with a magnifying glass. He then returned to the house. I ran to the staircase eagerly to meet him. "I checked for the sake of your peace of mind, but no one has been up that tree," he called to me as he ascended the stairs. "The bark of the trunk is quite intact." "Then we are back where we started," I said with disappointment. Yet unlike me, Holmes was no longer groping in the dark for an answer. I could tell by the slight smile with which he gazed into the crown of the plane tree. By then, we had retreated again to the study, where we found peace away from the curious employees. Holmes intended to acquaint them with the results of his investigation only after he had arranged his thoughts and reported his findings to the police inspectors. He was already in the process of summarizing a full report for the latter. "It is not always necessary to seek sensation and complexity where there is none. You already know that," he began deliberately, sitting down on the window casing and fiddling with his magnifying glass. "After all, it is usually quite elementary, my dear Watson. You must admit that a number of our cases have, on the contrary, been rather complicated." "Quite so, but I always start from the simplest explanations in my deductions," he exclaimed. "Please be so kind as to recapitulate for me exactly how, from a medical perspective, death by burning occurs," he requested in a friendly manner. I shuddered at the very thought. Well, the victim first begins to suffocate. I strove not to be overly suggestive. He is prevented from breathing by the hot smoke which burns the airways. The combustion produces carbon dioxide, which soon renders the individual unconscious. And besides that, also carbon monoxide, a deadly poisonous gas, which then kills. The question remains, however, whether the shock of the body's nerve endings being subjected to excruciating pain may occur sooner. As a result, the blood pressure drops, the internal organs shut down, and death occurs. As I have already mentioned, I know of no crueler way to die. Holmes held up a finger, and that answers one part of your question. I do not follow. Sir Roger was entirely incapable of defending himself from the fire, for he had drunken himself into a stupor. When the flames blazed up, he inhaled the fumes in his sleep and never woke up again. But he did not get intoxicated on his own, I exclaimed, still searching to defend at least a part of my theory. There are 2 glasses on the table. Someone must have been with him. There are indeed 2 glasses, but he drank from both of them, the detective announced. It makes sense. The first glass is cracked. He may have struck it inadvertently, and I believe he spilled the spirit onto his clothing. So he took a new one. In any case, he drank all morning, dissatisfied with his situation, perusing his papers over and over, searching for loopholes, until drunken sleep overcame him. After all, he was able to endure a great deal with his constitution. How can you be so sure? I examined them. Sir Roger took great care of his hands and applied cream to them. I found traces of it on the bottom of both glasses as he warmed them in his hands. Slowly, the meaning of his words dawned on me. So it was not murder, I sputtered. I am absolutely certain it was not. Then, pray tell, how do you explain his spontaneous combustion? I dared not breathe with anticipation. Did a ball of lightning fly into the study? Or have you started believing in pyromaniac spirits? Holmes did not answer immediately, but continued to hold up the magnifying glass, which glittered in the sunlight. At first, I thought he was hesitating over how to put his thoughts into words, but then the dry sheet of paper on the table next to the armchair began to smoulder, and a moment later, a tiny flame appeared. Sir Roger fell asleep in the armchair next to the open window, his waistcoat soaked with alcohol. He had put down his papers and removed his spectacles automatically shortly beforehand. The portrait in the hall shows him without them, so I judge that he wore them for reading only. He was far-sighted. I am certain his staff will confirm this. He placed them on the table beside the armchair, which is situated beneath the window, so they were within arm's reach. The laws of optics and a very cruel fate took care of the rest, he stated. For his reading spectacles have convex lenses, which are thicker in the middle than at the edges. The lens of the spectacles had previously, just as Holmes' magnifying glass with its convex lens had now, amplified the effects of the morning sunlight, and when positioned at the right angle, actually had the power to ignite a fire. By cruel accident, Singleton had tossed aside his spectacles so that they landed on the side table, intensifying the refraction of the incoming light beams with their focal length. The alcohol-soaked linen waistcoat then served as the tinder and reagent. If you look outside, you will notice that the sun, like in our own rooms, illuminates this room in the morning, whereas now it is slowly receding behind the trees. He pointed out the window. This is a prime example of being in the wrong place at the wrong time. The events that must have occurred here that morning unfolded before my eyes. Yet Holmes's bold hypothesis answered all the established facts beyond any doubt. That the fire had burned only half the body, and the fact that the rest of the study had remained intact. It had only heated the air enough to warm the metal door handle. One could compare it to a burning candle wick. Sir Roger's garments had started to burn, but before the pain could rouse him, the poisonous flames from the fire had intoxicated him. As soon as the flames had breached his skin, the heat began to dissolve the subcutaneous fat, which then seeped and was absorbed into the fabric, nourishing the fire for several hours. For even an ordinary human body contains many pounds of fat, let alone the body of a stout shipping magnate. The flames then burn in an upward direction and do not fan out. As for the legs and arms, they contain the least fat and were hanging downwards, thus being spared. I shuddered in disgust. Indeed, there is no death more cruel than that by burning, but in this case, I was glad there was no human agent behind the incident whose soul was so corrupt as to plan and execute so horrible a murder. No, this case was nothing like the rampage of the Cornish arsonist we had encountered a year before. At last the footsteps of the police investigators could be heard outside the door, and Inspector Lestrade burst into the study. His eyes protruded from their sockets upon seeing the charred torso of Sir Roger, and he clearly went to some effort to keep his stomach from turning. Having noticed us, however, he fought to maintain decorum. "You're here already," he greeted us, staring helplessly at the havoc all around us. "Well, I wonder how we're going to solve this one. The chaps downstairs said it was a mystery." Holmes glanced discreetly at his pocket watch. A mere 30 minutes had elapsed since our arrival. He gave Lestrade and his men precisely the same amount of time before delivering his explanation.